This is a final audio check from 2123, testing 1, 2.
In just a minute, we're going to begin. We've had some problems, but I think it's all fixed except for the big. To give our digital team some notice, there we go. The Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce will now come to order. Today, we will be holding a legislative hearing entitled Pandemic Profiteering, Legislation to Stop Corporate Price Gouging. So due to COVID-19, public health emergency, members can participate in today's hearing either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. Members who are participating in person must wear masks except when you are speaking. Staff and press who are present in the room must wear masks. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphones each time that you wish to speak. Please note that once you are unmuted, your microphones will catch everything you say. So you want to make sure that you go on mute when you aren't speaking. Since members are participating from different locations at today's hearing, all recognition of members shall be for, let's see, I'm sorry, you know, my reading thing. For questions will be in the order of subcommittee seniority. Documents for the record can be sent to Ed Koznerek. He at the end at the what is this? At the email address that we have provided to staff, all documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair now recognizes herself for an opening statement of 5 minutes. So today we will consider legislation to protect consumers from corporate greed and price gouging related to the pandemic. The COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act will empower the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general with the enforcement tools that are needed to effectively go after price gougers. Throughout the pandemic health emergency, we have seen skyrocketing billionaire wealth and corporate greed take advantage of people's fears and uncertainty and needs. We have seen actually unconscionable price hikes in everyday consumer goods like toilet paper, face masks, and hand sanitizers, as well as critical medical supplies like respirators and personal protective equipment. In the last month alone, we have seen Big Pharma increase the price of 554 drugs with an average price hike of 6.3%. Pfizer has raised prices on 125 drugs, more than any other company. This came after Pfizer reported record profits in 2021 from their taxpayer-funded COVID-19 vaccines, and after boosting their CEO pay 17% to $21 million. Johnson & Johnson executives are no different. They raised prices across all consumer health products, despite a 13.6% increase in revenues last year and projected $3 to $5 billion in revenue in 2022 from their COVID-19 vaccine alone. Instead of giving Americans a break from skyrocketing prices, companies are pocketing this extra cash. Last week, it was reported that United Health Group spent $5 billion buying back its own stock and paying shareholders $5 billion in dividends in 2021. This came after it reported $24 billion in profits, the largest ever in its industry's history. And these trends aren't limited to health-related goods and services. S&P 500 companies' 2001 earnings were up nearly 50% for the year, and corporate profit margins reached a 70% year high. Procter & Gamble has repeatedly raised prices on its U.S. products during the pandemic, while raking in $21 billion in profits in 2021, up 6% from the previous year. Grocery giant Kroger posted record earnings during the pandemic, including $132 billion in 2020, all while raising prices, decreasing wages paid to workers by 8.1%, authorizing billions in stock buybacks, and its CEO taking a $6.4 million raise. That's just the raise. And enough is enough. We are at war with this pandemic, war with this virus. And during World War II, war profiteers were held accountable. The same should be applied here today. We are absolutely at war, and we have to take action. We will not tolerate corporations taking advantage of American consumers by price gouging, especially not during a pandemic. So this critical legislation needs to be heard and ultimately passed. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here, and I now recognize Mr. Bilirakis for his 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the witnesses as well. Our constituents are facing a serious problem with inflation, and as we have seen from recent mishaps by the Biden administration, we need to be smarter about our policy choices so the situation, okay, excuse me, yeah, okay. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't express some disappointment that we're not joining in the theme of our friends in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Madam Chair, who are discussing a path forward on autonomous vehicles, which will provide a true opportunity to transform our economy and save thousands of lives. That said, I certainly don't want to dismiss the importance of our discussion here today about how our constituents are paying higher and higher prices. I greatly respect the work we tasked the FTC with executing. And as our comprehensive privacy and data security draft bill demonstrates, I also believe in working closely with the state attorneys general to help enforce a preemptive law. But we must have an honest discussion about the real challenges our country and constituents are facing, rather than a bait and switch about where to push blame. I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are aware of inflation problems and the crunch on our supply chain. And the president was questioned about this in his most recent press conference. However, somehow we're supposed to be convinced that there is widespread price gouging occurring. Even the majority's memo for today's hearing disputes its own thesis by footnoting an article from the Washington Post called "The Inflation Causing Financial Strain for Nearly Half of U.S. Households." That article doesn't reference price gouging once. Instead, it attributes increased prices to surging inflation, booming consumer demand, and crippled supply chains. Not that price gouging is not occurring, but we have to address the real problems. The article even goes on to say, and I quote, "The picture is further complicated by a widespread labor shortage and the revolving door of the pandemic," unquote. The legislation brought forth by the chair today, which would give board, again, more new authorities, broad new authorities, in my opinion, to the FTC to go after price gouging during the public health emergency, does not define what excessive price gouging is and does not adequately account for any of the causes for increased prices. The legislation is missing a full account for the supply and consumer demand of certain goods, the bottlenecking of our ports and distribution centers, current labor shortages, or even the organized crime ripping goods right off freight rail, like we're seeing in cities like Los Angeles. This committee should seek to avoid unintended consequences on businesses when protecting consumers. And thus, I can't support this legislation in front of us today. And we shouldn't let it divert our attention from President Biden's big government spending programs and over-regulation that are crushing our economy and keeping it from fully recovering. The fact is, I'm not sure the American public buys into the narrative either. They know that honest local mom and pop stores are doing their best with whatever products they can get their hands on. Add to that a recent article from the New York Post reporting the results of a study that found 69% of respondents disapprove of how President Biden is responding to the inflation crisis, with only 29% approving. This committee has a duty to protect consumers and promote commerce. We have supported providing FTC with the tools they need to be successful, like when we gave them first-time civil penalty authority to go after COVID-19 scams. But giving consumers a false protection here without properly identifying actual harms will give the FTC chair more unchecked powers at a time when her actions should receive more sunshine. Where's the sunshine in this case? I'm hopeful this committee can get back to the business of how to grow our economy with innovation springing from clear regulatory frameworks like for AVs and artificial intelligence, and protect consumers with clearly defined authorities for FTC like we do in our privacy and data security draft. I know we can do better. With that, Madam Chair, thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I thank the witnesses for being here again, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and just want to point out, I think that we're making some real progress on the AV issue, and I certainly agree that we need to be working on that promptly. So, yeah, it is good news. And at this point, I want to welcome the chair of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, certainly we could work on AVs, but I mean, I got to be honest with you, I think AVs are not the answer to inflation and price gouging and our economic problems. It's certainly something we can do, but it's not something that's going to solve that problem or any of those problems. My concern right now, and I don't want to go into it, I just get the impression more and more, and I hope it doesn't continue to the end of the session, that, you know, the answer to everything that we talk about is no. You know, we talk about the Competes Act. We were at rules yesterday. I've been hearing for the last year or so from the Republicans about China and the competition from China. But yes, when we were at the Rules Committee yesterday, no, we can't do this bill. This bill is no good. This isn't going to solve the problem. Now we talk about price gouging. Well, I can't support this bill because this bill isn't going to solve the price gouging problem. I mean, I just hope I'm wrong and that we just don't get between now and the election nothing but we can't do this, we can't do that. It's just sad because I want to work on a bipartisan basis on everything, even AVs. But we're just, you know, we're really not getting much cooperation from the other side, in all honesty. Now, let me just say that we still face major challenges with our economy, clearly, but we are seeing major signs of economic recovery. Last year, overall gross domestic product grew 5.7%, the highest annual rate in nearly 4 decades. The economy added 6.4 million jobs, the largest annual increase in American history. That historic job creation reduced unemployment from 15% at the beginning of last year to just 3.9% today. Wages are increasing. We did have the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I say bipartisan, but I think there were only 12 House Republicans that supported it. And we do now lead the world in our economic pandemic recovery. But our economy, while it is recovering, it's true that American families are still struggling to make ends meet, rising prices for food and other household necessities. But a lot of these price increases are a result of the ongoing pandemic. That's why we're taking action later this week to pass the America Competes Act. I hope we do get some Republican support. That deals with the supply chain issue and shortages of critical goods and tries to have more goods made here in the USA, and yes, reduce, make us more competitive with China and other countries. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of price gouging taking place. Some businesses are simply price gouging consumers. And these actions have been constant throughout the pandemic, evolving with each phase and disproportionately harming the most vulnerable when they can least afford it. And opportunist price gouging initially focused on the sudden need for items like personal protective equipment and hand sanitizer, but more recently, we've heard reports of overpriced COVID test kits and face masks, and now pandemic profiteering has expanded to virtually all types of consumer goods. And I do think that corporate greed is motivating large companies to use the pandemic and supply chain issues as an excuse to raise prices simply because they can. And a lot of executives brazenly boast to investors about raising prices on consumers without consequences. And these executives are saying they're going to continue to do so. The legislation under discussion today is basically designed to bring this outrageous price gouging to an end. The act is a straightforward solution to the immediate problem. It's introduced by Chair Schakowsky, and along with myself, Representatives Cicilline and Latta, would give the FTC the authority to seek civil penalties from those price gouging during the COVID-19 pandemic. States' attorney generals would be able to enforce the legislation without losing any of their existing authority under state law. And the fact of the matter is, there is no federal price gouging law today. And while most states do have some kind of authority, those laws are inconsistent, and many fail to address the unique circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Congress has to give the FTC and state the authority enforcement tools they need to go after companies that are gouging consumers. It's mostly large companies. So I look forward to the discussion today and hope we can find bipartisan agreement to act on this important legislation that puts consumers first. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning and welcome to our witnesses. American families are feeling the pain of one-party rule. President Biden's inflation has hit a 40-year high. Prices have risen across the board, from the pump to the grocery store and everything in between. I just heard a mom in my district who is struggling to find baby formula. And she said, this supply chain crisis is really hurting my family in being able to find food. I appreciate the comments of the chairman, but I think the frustration on this side of the aisle for many Republicans is that we continue to see a go-it-alone approach, bills that are being put together in the Speaker's office without input from the Republicans. And the fact of the matter is the Democrats have the votes. They're running the show. And we see record spending, we see top-down mandates, COVID-19 restrictions, surging energy costs that are making rising prices and empty shelves worse. It's all connected. To be transparent with Americans about rising prices, today's topic should be focused on how to reverse the damage that is resulting in supply chain and inflation crises. Unfortunately, what we see is a diversion. It's a deliberate diversion on the root issues, on the issue of price gouging. Standing up against those who have profiteered during the pandemic is a bipartisan issue. Last Congress, I joined with Chairman Pallone and Subcommittee Chair Schakowsky, along with then Ranking Member Walden, in sending a letter to the FTC. The letter requested bi-weekly updates from the FTC on their tracking of illegal behavior during the pandemic, like price gouging and scams. And I'll be entering that letter into the record. So a question is, if the majority believes this is a top concern, why don't you restart the FTC updates this Congress? And why don't you consider our suggestions from 2 years ago on how to make this legislation better? Again, we see a go-it-alone approach. They seem to be more comfortable in the partisan solution. As I said, today's hearing is a deliberate diversion from the inflation crisis. The COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act still contains the flaws it did 2 years ago. For instance, it fails to define what constitutes an excessive price increase, despite many states having established their own laws specifying an allowable percentage while taking into account supply chain factors. This proposal is supposed to be targeting the goods and services during the public health emergency that are the most vulnerable to gouging, but it fails to address the real issues for spiking prices. It doesn't take into account when schools are forced to shut down. Many parents leave the workforce, unable to participate in the economy. It doesn't address workers being forced out of their job for refusing to submit to vaccine mandates. It doesn't take into account that we are in a very different stage of this pandemic than we were 2 years ago. It doesn't take into account hundreds of billions of dollars that Democrats continue to pump into the economy, causing consumer demand to spike, even as fewer products are available due to supply chain strains and workforce shortages. The record spending by the federal government only exacerbates the inflationary death spiral. Last Congress, we were able to enact bipartisan, bicameral legislation for the first offense penalty authority to tackle COVID-19 scams. It's disappointing that that legislation failed to be included today. Let's work together. Let's work together. We all agree. We want America to compete, America to lead. My colleague brought up the issue of autonomous vehicles. Today, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is having a hearing on autonomous vehicles. 1 month from now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology within the House Science Committee, which has jurisdiction over, is holding a workshop on autonomous vehicles. We're talking about price gouging. I was pleased to hear the subcommittee chair say that she's open to autonomous vehicle legislation. 4 years ago, we passed bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats came together and passed legislation to lay out a national standard for framework for autonomous vehicles. We need that in order to win the future. We hear a lot about electric vehicles, but we need the autonomous vehicle language, the framework. That is our future, and America should be leading in developing this technology rather than allowing China to continue to dominate and test and move forward. My colleagues and I are ready to work on real solutions, whether it's supply chains, inflation, innovation. Let's win the future. Let's work together. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the chair would like to remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, that any written opening statements shall be made part of the record. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. We have Alex Harmom, competition policy advocate at Public Citizen, and who is here remotely. We have Sarah Frasch, who is Chief Deputy Attorney General and Director for the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General. We have Dr. Glenn Ritchie, Jr., Harvard eminent scholar and chair for the Department of Supply Chain Management at Auburn University, and Dr. Rakim, Mabud, who is Managing Director of Policy and Research and Chief Economist at Groundwork Collaboration. At this time, the chair will recognize each of the witnesses for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I would just like to explain the light system for those who don't know it, and for those who are watching, who are participating remotely as well. At first, in front of you will be, and you'll see on the screen, a series of lights. The light will initially be green. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining, and please begin to wrap up your testimony. And at that point, the light will turn red when those 5 minutes have expired. For the witnesses testifying remotely, there is a time on your screen that will count down your remaining time. So, Mr. Harmom, You are recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, and other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you in person on corporate price gouging and profiteering during the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Alex Harmon, Competition Policy Advocate for Public Citizens Congress Watch Division. We're a national nonprofit organization with more than 500,000 members and supporters. For the past 50 years, we've represented the public interest on a broad range of issues, including consumer protection and consolidation of corporate power. I think it is important to first explain what price gouging is. For those of us who remember our basic economics classes, we learned that supply and demand are supposed to result in a market-based price that reflects what consumers are willing to pay. And when that price rises too high, a competitor will respond with a lower price, or consumers will find an alternative. But price gouging is where that supply and demand process is distorted by an emergency situation that puts the seller in the position of dictating a price above market, because consumers have no other choice but to pay. At its best, it is exploitive of consumers across the board. But at its worst, it specifically targets people in their most vulnerable, making conditions even worse for them. Unfortunately, even before the country faced lockdowns, closures, and shortages of essential goods due to the coronavirus pandemic, price gouging was already underway. In fact, by the time the first US death from COVID-19 had been reported, price gouging on sales of protective masks on Amazon had already resulted in warnings to third-party sellers against engaging in the practice. Then, brick-and-mortar retail stores such as Target, Costco, and Kroger began to impose quantity limits on products such as toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and disinfectants. But where physical stores had empty shelves, online sellers charged excessive prices. As the pandemic worsened, so too did price gouging. Over nearly 2 years, price gouging has shifted to a broad array of products and, unfortunately, normalized. Consumers and policymakers cannot be blamed for wondering if price increases on essential products are at least in part due to price gouging. Many Americans experienced the pandemic facing unemployment, financial hardship, or in dangerous conditions on the front lines of the healthcare and service industries. However, for the biggest companies, the pandemic proved to be a goldmine of increased profits and significant growth. Amazon, Walmart, Kroger, and many others experienced significant price increases, or profit increases, in 2020. But in the second year of the pandemic, sales and profits continued to rise to record levels for retailers. This reality of massive corporate profits has been true for consumer packaged goods and food manufacturers as well. In addition to record sales and profits, these companies have no shame about their plans to raise prices. In fact, they have been bragging to investors about how they are able to raise prices without driving down sales. Procter & Gamble's chief financial officer told investors that the company has not seen any material reaction to price increases from consumers. And Kroger's CFO told their investors, "We've been very comfortable with our ability to pass on the increases that we've seen to this point." These companies are only making more profit as they raise prices in the face of higher costs. Is it any wonder, then, that the companies are so eager to raise prices? In a recent piece by former US Labor Secretary Robert Reich, he argues that these companies are exploiting higher costs as an excuse to make even bigger profits. It is hard to disagree. Corporate price gouging is unacceptable and should be stopped. Unfortunately, there is no federal price gouging law. So H.R. 675, the COVID Price Gouging Prevention Act, the subject of this hearing, was introduced by Chairwoman Schakowsky to establish a federal price gouging law in response to the initial reports of pandemic profiteering and price gouging. As members of Congress consider efforts to stop price gouging, it is worth examining state laws and where a federal statute would be useful to protect consumers. Unfortunately, where state laws prohibiting price gouging exist, there's a wide variance between definitions and applicability. The lack of a federal law, the inconsistency or absence of laws in the states, combined with online shopping that transcends state borders, has created gaps in protection from price gouging and has led to a potential for state laws to be ineffective at addressing the practice online. Price gouging is an exploitive business practice that manipulates markets and takes advantage of people at their most vulnerable and desperate. A federal statute that augments state laws is needed to address this problem. It should be in place as soon as possible to help stop price gouging now, and so that the next emergency, big or small, does not result in the exploitation we have seen in the last 2 years. During emergencies, people are scared, desperate, and in need. Price gouging is an insidious exploitation of the most vulnerable. There's no excuse for the most profitable companies preying on consumers. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on this important topic.
Thank you very Thank you very much. And now, Ms. Frasch, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member Billericus, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Sarah Frasch, and I serve as the Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection for the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General. Our section is charged with civil enforcement of Pennsylvania's consumer protection laws, including Pennsylvania's Price Gouging Act. In general, we work directly with consumers and businesses to both mediate disputes and to bring legal actions when necessary to stop unfair and deceptive business practices. We obtain restitution and other relief for consumers and appropriate civil penalties. So turning specifically to price gouging, we have our own Price Gouging Act in Pennsylvania, which was passed in 2006. It's given our office an important tool in our toolbox to help protect consumers when disasters
Ms.
strike.
Frasch, could you speak up just a little bit more?
Sure. This act protects consumers from unconscionably excessive price hikes, beginning when the governor declares a state of disaster emergency and then continuing through 30 days after the termination of the state of emergency. Generally, unconscionably excessive prices in violation of the act include price increases of 20% or more during the applicable time period when compared to the price 7 days prior to the state of emergency declaration. Our act in Pennsylvania gives our office the responsibility to enforce the law with civil penalties of up to $10,000 per violation. While this law is limited in scope, it does help us both combat and deter price gouging during disaster situations, including during the pandemic. In March of 2020, immediately following our governor's declaration of the state of emergency due to the pandemic, we set up a task force within our bureau to accept, investigate, and act on the tips and complaints of price gouging made by the public. Most of those tips covered different consumer products, but we found most prevalent were PPE equipment, hand sanitizer, bottled water, things like that, face masks. One example of a tip we received was from a husband of a nurse in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He was concerned that his wife and her coworkers didn't have the appropriate access to PPE, such as N95 masks during the first weeks of the pandemic. So one of his employees was in a local pharmacy, filling a prescription, saw that the store had N95 masks available, and she purchased them. She was able to get 5 masks and was charged $20 per mask. For context, before the declaration was issued, N95 masks could be obtained for less than $1. And even factoring in the increase of the cost and the supply incurred by the pharmacy, that price to the consumer was significantly increased, in clear violation of our statute. And we were able to contact that store, and as a result, that buyer received a refund of the full amount. She was overcharged, and the store was able to bring back the prices to reasonable levels, preventing other consumers from being harmed. So this the declaration remained in effect from March 2020 through June 2021. And at that time, we received around 6,200 consumer complaints of price gouging from all over Pennsylvania. Some of these were actually mistakes by businesses. They didn't understand the law, perhaps, and they corrected their action after we approached them. Others fell outside the scope of our statute because maybe there were business-to-business transactions that didn't cover household use goods. Many of these cases also involved increased costs to the local stores that they themselves pass on to the consumers, which is actually legal under our statute. But we did not hesitate to use our enforcement under the act, and we were able to issue 523 cease and desist letters to individuals and entities. We issued 241 subpoenas to gather more information. We filed 2 lawsuits for violations of the act. We also entered into 29 settlement agreements separate from any litigation, and we resolved those. And ultimately, we were able to return $73,272 in consumer restitution to make those consumers whole. We also focused on a multi-state effort to engage with major e-commerce platforms such as eBay, Amazon, and Facebook, and others in order to enhance protections. As a result of those efforts, we were able to identify additional price gouging, take appropriate action, and obtain refunds for consumers, and also have those platforms take down violations of the act. And we were able to present presentations to trade groups, consumer advocates, and other retailers to help educate and inform what violations may be. So as I mentioned, we have some limitations for acts right now. It's not currently.
So your time has expired, so wrap up right now.
Sure. Thank you. We have no protection currently for price gouging in place in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate your testimony. And now let me welcome Dr. Ritchie for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
To be part of this process. My name is Glenn Ritchie. As mentioned, I'm the Harvard Eminent Scholar in Supply Chain Management at Auburn University, where we hold the number 7 undergraduate program in supply chain management in North America, and also have a top 10 research program globally in supply chain management and logistics. I'm also currently the editor-in-chief or co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Logistics, which is largely considered the top journal in supply chain management and logistics worldwide. My other hat that I wear is in the research director position of the Center for Supply Chain Innovation, and so I can talk to issues with technology if you like. I have about a decade of experience in practice in wholesaling and manufacturing, and have done now for about 20 years research in international business, supply chain management, and logistics and marketing. I should also add that I have experienced a lot of different disasters over the course of my life, living in a lot of states around this country, and that includes tornadoes in Ohio and Oklahoma, floods in Tennessee, hurricanes in Alabama, heat waves in Maine, and storms in Texas, ice storms in Texas. So you probably don't want to live next to me, but I've experienced a lot of the post-crisis behavior, which seems to be what we're talking about in this resolution. The HR 675 resolution is interesting. I will say that I got confused about it quickly because price gouging typically occurs at the retail level during these crises, and it tends to be relatively small players. Corporate strategy level price gouging does not happen to the degree that has been suggested in the document. And that's because it's quite obvious to see. It's obvious to see to government and to business. I dug a bit deeper as well to look into the America Competes Act. And in reading that act, I was concerned that Congress may not understand the complexities of supply chains and the things that we have to deal with. So I've added a couple of comments in my written testimony to kind of flesh those things out. And later on, if the committee would like more documentation or things that try to explain what we do, I'd be happy to get into that and follow up with those materials. There's several specific issues that concern me about the current legislation, the current discussion, and that has to do with a couple of different things. One being the local level concern, and we're talking about corporate level. The other being that I took some time last night to look at the supply chain management publications that are out there and found almost no discussion of price gouging over the years of 2020 and 2021. So I'm here to address some of the big concerns on the list, and I'll list those for you. There are 8. One is specificity in the document. I don't know what unconscionable, excessive, or increased prices unreasonably or grossly exceeds is. There's no kind of barrier on what those things are. There's no emphasis in facing what contribution margin is, which really defines what companies make. It's the difference between what their costs and what their prices are. I'm worried about the passage of time. February of 2022 is dramatically different than the economic concerns of January of 2020. And so that seems a bit strange to me. I'm concerned that similar products and substitute products in the legislation will be compared based on their pricing and not on their cost or their quality or their value. I'm worried that the term corporate could be extended directly down to small businesses, local mom and pop grocery stores that are struggling mightily in this time period and would even put them in a more difficult position than they are now. I'm concerned that the government at the federal level will not be able to handle monitoring the supply chain because of the level of complexity, and I'm happy to talk about that. I also think that there are a number of things in this legislation that would be unenforceable. When we talk about companies that have raised prices during the pandemic, Just about everyone should be able to show additional cost, loss of control, negative impacts on profit, lost sales, and additional risks that have been incurred that will drive prices up naturally in the market economy. And the other thing is first responders are the ones that typically deal with these problems. It's the people that are within the states and within the communities, and I'm not certain how DC handles that problem. Finally, I'd like to say that we have a number of movements in price that happen in the supply chain and across the economy. Companies may raise prices to cover fixed costs, to add a replacement supplier, incorporate rising transportation costs, restart a sustainability program that was stopped during the pandemic, to respond to energy crisis, and maybe just to adjust to existing or new government replacements. So in summary, there's a lot of issues to worry about here, to be concerned about here. But I thank you for having me, and I'm happy to help the committee if I can.
Thank you. And now I invite Dr. Mabud to give his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Rakeen Mabud, and I'm the Chief Economist and Managing Director of Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative. Groundwork is an economic policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to advancing a coherent economic worldview that produces broadly shared prosperity and abundance for all. I'm grateful to the subcommittee for holding this hearing about the critical issues of pandemic profiteering and price gouging. My testimony will focus on 3 key points. First, pandemic profiteering is widespread and is taking a massive toll on consumers, workers, and small businesses, all while corporate executives and shareholders are enjoying record profits. Second, today's profiteering is the direct result of decades of policy choices, resulting in an imbalanced and brittle economy that allows mega corporations to profit from crises. Third, wage increases for workers are not a driver of current price spikes. Big corporations have taken advantage of shifting demand to raise prices on essentials like COVID tests and masks. Just last month, after the CDC updated its guidance for the public to, quote, wear the most protective masks you can, producers of critical PPE immediately cashed in. In early October, a 50-pack of Kimberly-Clark N95 masks cost $23.19. By mid-January, the same box cost $57.15. In Kimberly-Clark's earnings call last week, the CEO noted that, quote, while our overall financial results were disappointing, we took decisive action to offset the impact of higher costs with significant pricing actions. On the same call, he said that Kimberly-Clark would allocate more cash to shareholders through dividends and buybacks. In other words, even though the company was experiencing a disappointing quarter, Kimberly-Clark's CEO was confidently telling shareholders that he would be able to deliver their payouts, all on the backs of consumers paying higher prices for essential items. Unfortunately, profiteering is not limited to pandemic-specific goods. Take Procter & Gamble, a Fortune 500 company with a chokehold on diaper production and more than a quarter of the global market on laundry products. In the company's January 19th earnings call, their CFO announced price increases in all 10 of their product categories in 2021, with more to come in 2022. He stated, quote, building on the strength of our brands, we are thoughtfully executing tailored price increases. We see a lower reaction from the consumer in terms of price elasticity than what we would have seen in the past. In other words, the company is taking advantage of consumers' basic needs because demand is relatively unresponsive to price hikes for goods like diapers. The ability to raise prices without seeing consumer demand drop, combined with significant market share, gives companies like Procter & Gamble free rein over price increases and ever-increasing profit margins, especially when they can blame inflation for the rising prices. Corporations have this kind of power because of Wall Street's ruthless pursuit of efficiency and short-term profits that ushered in a deeply concentrated economy that leaves consumers vulnerable to profiteering and price gouging. The unending quest for maximizing short-term returns has resulted in deregulation of everything from shipping to rail. As corporate executives prioritized a lean, just-in-time supply system that eliminated resiliency and increasingly relied on precarious labor, our economy was left more vulnerable to price gouging and pandemic profiteering. Corporations have been able to keep costs low and reap profits without any risk of being undercut by competition, all at the expense of stability and reliability for consumers and small businesses. While concentrated market power isn't the only reason for our current plight, it plays a critical role in propping up an imbalanced economy that prioritizes profits over a functioning system. Finally, I'd like to address a common misperception about the role of worker wages on the price hikes. Recent research demonstrates that there has been no correlation between price increases and wage increases since December 2020. In short, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest wage increases for workers are to blame for the price increases we're seeing today. There's a clear path forward for Congress. First, Congress should take up H.R. 675, the COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act. This legislation would create a clear framework to identify and prohibit profiteering and provide the Federal Trade Commission, as well as state attorneys general, the power to protect consumers from corporate price gouging. Second, the committee can continue to ensure that the FTC investigates anti-competitive, deceptive, and unfair business practices to protect consumers and encourage competition. The best path towards an inclusive, resilient economy is to support policies that foster competitive markets where consumers, working people, and smaller competitors all have meaningful bargaining power. Smart investments coupled with regulatory safeguards will reduce costs and prices in the long run, ensure that no one is left behind during the recovery period and beyond. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We have now concluded with the witnesses' opening statements. At this time, we will move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. The effect of COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has hurt and felt especially hard on those people who are low income and working people. Corporate price increases are no exception. Thankfully, we are seeing long overdue wage growth in our country and increased worker bargaining power. But these gains are threatened by rising prices. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have argued that increased wages could produce a, quote, wage price spiral, unquote, where high prices cause higher wages, which then leads to even higher prices continues the cycle. But others, like the Federal Reserve Chair Powell, disagrees. So, Dr. Mabud, in your research, have you found that rising wages are troubling? Do you believe that that they are responsible at all for the price increases that we are seeing today?
Thank you, Chair Schifkowski. It is crystal clear that wages are not the main driver of rising prices right now. Since the start of the pandemic, there has been absolutely no relationship between rising wages and rising prices. While there has been a link historically, that's not the case today. In fact, the sectors of the economy that saw the highest price increases are not correlated with where we've been seeing significant wage growth. But the other important thing is that too many workers have been facing rock bottom wages for decades. The secular decline in unionization has really harmed many workers' access to economic mobility and security. And the fact that we're seeing wages for especially the lowest income in our economy in the midst of a crisis is frankly a real testament to the importance of the federal investments that Congress made throughout the pandemic.
Thank you. So do you think then that there are any risks to working families from trying to combat rising prices by limiting wage growth?
Absolutely. Tamping down on wage growth and demand is the last thing that working families need in the midst of an unprecedented health and economic crisis. Increased demand is actually a really strong signal that families are weathering the storm, and it suggests that we're going to come out of this crisis with a stronger foundation for our economy, one that's broad-based and inclusive. Raising interest rates or other actions that will stifle demand or wage growth would harm exactly the people who are currently bearing the brunt of rising prices, families and small businesses around the country.
So let me ask you finally, Dr. Mabud, in your research, what evidence have you found of corporate price gouging?
So my team and I have combed through hundreds of earnings calls across a broad range of sectors, which has really given us a window into what CEOs across the economy are thinking. And what we are seeing is that in sector after sector, in company after company, corporations are jacking up prices on consumers and using concerns about inflation as cover to do so. We see that in Kimberly-Clark taking advantage of the pandemic to raise prices on masks. We see Procter & Gamble using the fact that they sell essential goods that families depend on, like diapers, to raise prices in this moment of crisis. And we even see companies like McDonald's raising prices on consumers, even as they enjoy massive increases in sales. So in short, this is a really broad-based problem. It's unfortunately not limited to a specific sector of the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Harmon, why is legislation to empower the FTC and state attorneys general critical to stop price gouging?
Thank you. Well, there's no federal law, so the FTC has no authority to take any action. It is not considered illegal. They can collect information, but they can't take action. And there are states that have no protections as well, and so there's a lack of overall protection. And then there's this larger question of where there is price gouging online and on national marketplaces, whether the state laws can even cover those issues.
Thank you. We saw Amazon raise prices at the beginning of the pandemic and, really hurting consumers. So my 5 minutes have expired, and now I welcome the ranking member for his questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Madam Chair. Thank you. And I want to thank the witnesses as well. Our constituents are facing a serious problem with inflation. And as we have seen in recent mishaps by the Biden administration, we need to be smarter, folks, about our policy choices so the situation does not worsen. One of the contributing factors to higher prices and fewer goods is the bottleneck at our ports and distribution centers that are causing a delay in goods from reaching our constituents. That's why I was very glad to see our Governor DeSantis, offer up the ports of Florida to alleviate the bottlenecking in California, where cargo ships wade in the water. They're waiting to unload their cargo. I just want to reiterate his words and say Florida is here to help. So I want everyone to know Florida is here to help with this issue. Sadly, it appears that President Biden is no closer to solving this problem. The Transportation Intermediaries Association recently quoted to Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas regarding their dire concern about the vaccine mandates, which recently were ruled, as you know, unconstitutional. But they will still take their toll since DHS is applying the mandate to international truckers, hopefully not for long, even after U.S. truckers were deemed exempt because of the nature of their work. So my question is to Dr. Ritchie. Dr. Ritchie, if the administration is going to limit the truck drivers available for transport, and we already have a truck driver shortage here in the United States, shouldn't the White House set up some sort of framework, such as autonomous systems that I understand are available, that will keep these products moving? In addition to the effect on consumers, this could also greatly impact suppliers and cause them to go bankrupt. Can you explain how new technologies on the market may help alleviate these issues? Again, the question is for Dr. Ritchie. I'm not sure if he's able to communicate with us, Madam Chair. Dr. Ritchie, please?
I'm here. Yes, sorry.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We have the RFID lab here at Auburn University that does a number of different research activities around high-level technologies in the supply chain and business overall. Certainly, we have some advancements that we're working on in over-the-road trucking. There's still work to do in that arena to get those vehicles to where they can do what we want them to do. As you know, every intersection in this country is different, and so the vehicles have to be able to handle those contingencies and differences. There are also other things that we could potentially do. Automated material handling equipment is heavily used in international ports throughout Europe, and it's not used to the same degree in the United States. That would certainly be something that we could work for and get into place in the ports of Los Angeles and LA. That currently are bringing in about 40% of all the international inventory and supplies that we see, and are potentially impacting every citizen in the United States. Outside of that, there are things that we can do with drones related to nearby delivery, but currently those situations are restricted by both state and federal law. So freeing up some of the legislation that's made it difficult to implement these things would help. And then we can also think about information technology. We've been doing tests with RFID to track products. We've been doing tests with blockchain technology that allows us to track transactions, cost of transactions and contracts. Motivating those things to move forward may help some with the crisis, but certainly for us, the labor crisis is still an issue. We need people to go back to work.
Thank you, Doctor. Now I'd like to read a quote from Jason Furman, and then the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. He states, and I quote, "The current inflation has many causes, including a post-pandemic reallocation of labor, a spending shift from services to goods, lingering supply chain disruptions, and rising global oil and gas prices," unquote. Dr. Ritchie, according to Furman, there are many factors to the increased costs consumers are currently facing. But one reason he doesn't include, in this particular case, is price gouging. So can you elaborate on what's really going on here? How do we fix the problem? And I appreciate your testimony today and answering the first question. Thank you.
Yeah, there are a number of issues that all contribute to the increase in prices in this country, and they have a lot to do with what we call transaction cost, which is economic policy or understanding and theory that was developed by Oliver Williamson.
I'm over here.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So there are a number of different inputs, right, that have to come into the process that drive up cost. So when we see scarcity in the supply chain, organizations obviously increase costs to cover fixed costs to make sure they can stay viable in the market. So that's why I earlier recommended that we take a look specifically at contribution margin and what the profit is per individual item, because it's very difficult to look at.
Dr. Ritchie, I apologize.
Yes.
I'm way over my 5 minutes,
Yes.
and I must yield back, but I appreciate it very
Fantastic.
much.
No worries.
Yeah, okay.
Madam Chair, can somebody check the microphones in the committee room or something? Once in a while, there's some background noise coming in. It doesn't look like it's coming from the mics on the screen. Sorry, just can we get that fixed? It's hard to hear people.
I'm sorry, what? Yeah, please stay muted if you're not speaking. If you're not speaking, we don't want that inadvertent background noise. And now, let me call on the chairman of the full committee for his 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Pallone?
Yeah, I just have to say before I ask a question, I respect Mr. Bilirakis, but I just don't understand. I mean, the biggest problem we have right now is COVID, right? The reason people are afraid to go back to work is because they're afraid they're going to be in contact with people that don't have vaccines or people that don't have masks, and the COVID continues to spread. I mean, talking about the answer is to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible, to try to get COVID ended so that people aren't afraid to go back to work. But I mean, I see I'm not saying it's true for you, Gus, but I see so many of my Republican colleagues, not suggesting that people should even be vaccinated or not talking about it at all. I mean, look, I'm not going to argue over the mandate, but the bottom line is we have to convince people to get vaccinated. Otherwise, we're never going to get over this COVID problem. And then when you talk about autonomous trucks, I mean, part of the problem with autonomous vehicles, or particularly trucks, is that, what does that mean? It displaces people? Of course we have to move towards autonomous vehicles or even autonomous trucks. We have to be very careful that we don't do this in a way that displaces truck drivers and that they don't have a job. And I don't think we're ready to literally say we're going to have some major autonomous trucks right now. I mean, that's something that has to be looked into, and we can certainly work on it on a bipartisan basis. But I'm very afraid of the fact that people who are driving trucks are going to be displaced. I don't want that to happen today. The problems here have to do with COVID, and we've got to get that under control. But the best way to do that is through vaccines. Now, I just wanted to say to the ranking member, when we talked about the price gouging, remember, this bill is a legislative hearing is just a start today. You mentioned several things that you would like to see in the legislation. We certainly would like to sit down with you over the next few days or next few weeks and figure out what those things are so we can have a bill on a bipartisan basis. The same is true for the AVs. We can do these things on a bipartisan basis, but, and I don't want to suggest that we can't. Now, let me just ask a couple questions. I wanted to ask Dr. Mabud, in your testimony, you suggest that some companies are using the cover of rising costs and pandemic-related supply chain issues to boost profits while consumers pay more. Can you just expand on that and answer whether there are particular industries where profiteering is most prevalent, if you would?
Sure, thank you, Chair Pallone. Unfortunately for consumers, this is a really deeply pervasive problem. The earnings call data we dug into suggests that this kind of profiteering is happening up in the supply chain and across a range of goods. Pandemic profiteering is not limited to a small corner of the economy. And some of the most flagrant examples of profiteering at big companies like Kroger and Procter & Gamble that sell products that people can't go without. And that's why HR 675 is so critical. It really takes on what has become rampant price hikes for consumers across the country.
All right. And then I wanted to ask Dr. Mabud again, do you agree that corporate price gouging is self-reinforcing? In other words, how does it help keep prices high even when the broader underlying price forces like supply chain disruptions and the pandemic appear to be heading in the right direction? The issue is self-reinforcing, if you will.
Yes, this is essentially the story of financialization. When one company is able to get away with padding their profits through price gouging, shareholders from across the board want in. And that's exactly what we've seen. Companies with aggressive pricing strategies are rewarded, and those who are not taking the strategy on have seen massive sell-offs. In other words, investors really come to expect these higher prices and these prices that are translating into higher returns for them. The other point to make here is that prices, with the exception of volatile commodities, fairly sticky. The cost of a soda or a toothbrush isn't just going to go down just when supply chain pressures ease. Consumers will be stuck with higher prices over the long haul.
All right, let me just ask either you or Dr. Harmon, are there particularly incentives for these companies that Congress should be considering working to stop price gouging? Or do you believe federal price gouging legislation is necessary to stop pandemic profiteering? Dr. Mahmoud?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Absolutely. Having a federal standard that is clear and widely applicable is absolutely critical to ensuring that price gougers are not able to get away with bad behavior.
So you think the legislation is necessary?
Correct.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back, and now I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start with autonomous vehicles. We hear a lot about electric vehicles in this hearing, or in this hearing room, in this committee. The majority, the president, the administration is all in on electric vehicles, believing that that's our future, not as concerned about displaced workers. I guess our question is, why can't we move forward on autonomous vehicles? I just read that the death rates have gone up pretty dramatically in the last year. On average, it's 37,000 on the roads, but I think we've already reached 31. We're getting close to that number already. So I believe that autonomous vehicles have the opportunity to save lives. It is our future. We should move forward. When it comes to drafting, to addressing solutions, whether it's solutions around rising cost on Americans or any legislation.
If I could just comment on that, in the infrastructure.
Okay.
Do you mind?
Well.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
I can give you an extra.
Okay, I'd love to hear what the update is on autonomous vehicles, because there was a bill that we passed bipartisan 4 years ago, and unanimously. Okay, and then on just jobs that are being displaced, right now, jobs are being shut down in the energy sector all across this country. Day one, it was the Keystone Pipeline. Now we talk about wanting to manufacture in the United States. We're shutting down mining. An Arizona mine, is it a cobalt mine? Minnesota, another mine being shut down. I think when it comes to solutions, and I appreciate the chairman talking about wanting to work together, I would welcome working together, but working together is not having the majority tell us, oh, here's the bill, will you support it? That's how this American Competes Act, our input has not been offered. This is what we put together. We've changed, some of the bipartisan bills that we did work on were changed when they were included in the draft. We're ready to come to the table. We need to be included earlier on in the process, not just told, this is our solution, will you join us? Okay, so on to the issue of rising cost in the United States of America. Dr. Ritchie, I shared a story about the mom that's struggling to find formula for a newborn. So I'd like to start with Dr. Ritchie, and if anyone on the panel can tell me yes or no, does this legislation in front of us address her struggles? And just would like to ask a quick yes or no of the panel, starting with Dr. Ritchie, the panelist. Dr. Ritchie, would this legislation help the mom that's trying to find formula?
Yeah, so I would say that it doesn't. Unfortunately, it does not address the supply chain crises and disruptions. Those disruptions create scarcity in the marketplace, and scarcity is what allows for price gouging and creates opportunities for increases in price.
Mr. Harmon?
I mean, I don't know the situation, but I would say it is not a supply chain legislation.
Dr. Mabud?
Yeah, part of what we're seeing here is really a need to address supply chain issues, which allow corporations to engage in profiteering and price gouging. And so this piece of legislation is one important piece of the puzzle in making sure that mother is able to provide formula for her child.
So, okay, and Mr. Frasch? Ms. Frasch, I'm sorry.
Right. We saw some supply chain issues in our local stores. And part of the reason why the local stores were charging more money was because it was harder to get the items. So if the supply chain issue may be corrected, then you may not have the price increases, which potentially could be caused by price gouging starting from the very beginning.
Right, so I appreciate that. I appreciate you highlighting that when supplies are not available, prices go up. And right now in the energy, we see our gas prices going up, nearly doubling the price of gas. And then the oil and gas companies are accused of gouging consumers. And this isn't something new. 100 years ago, I'd like to submit for the record a tweet from the former White House official, Bob McNally. He shows a newspaper reporting that one of the earliest FTC investigations of illegal market manipulation in the gasoline market, dating back to 1920, they found no evidence of anti-competitive behavior then, and guess what? I don't believe they're going to find it now. It's an issue of supply and demand. Putting aside the fact that the president wrote to the FTC, which is supposed to be an independent agency and not to be influenced by the White House, Dr. Ritchie, what do you think of the administration should be focused on in terms of securing our energy supply and keeping prices down? Oh, and I'm over. Okay. Dr. Ritchie, I'd appreciate you answering that question at a later time. Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I yield back. Appreciate your indulgence.
Thank you very much. I will refrain from trying to respond. We can talk later. Let me now call on Mr. Rush, Bobby Rush, my colleague from Illinois, for 5 minutes for his questions.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the ranking member for this hearing. At the onset, Madam Chair, I wanted to let you know that I am writing a letter to you requesting a hearing to address the allegations of racism that have been leveled against the National Football League by Brian Flores. That said, Madam Chair, Mr. Harmon, in your testimony, you mentioned how price gouging, quote, specifically targets people at their most vulnerable, at their most vulnerable, end of quote. Have you seen any evidence to suggest that racial minorities or low-income people are more likely to be subject to price gouging? If so, what specific actions can we take today to stem this abuse?
So, short answer at the front end is no, not specific empirical evidence of racial discrimination in price gouging. However, price gouging is primarily on items that are essential items, staples, things that people need now, and the people who tend to be faced with price gouging are people in emergencies, with economic crisis, with economic hardship, and people who are able, with means, to accommodate increased costs in their monthly budget are less affected by those increases, and people who are on fixed incomes and limited budgets, or are suffering unemployment or economic hardship due to the emergency, are going to be affected more directly and therefore disproportionately impacted. And so that tends to be people at the lower end of the economic scale and people in poverty, and that disproportionately, unfortunately, affects people of color.
Thank you. Ms. French, in your testimony, you discussed how Pennsylvania's price gouging statute only applies to, quote, personal, family, or household purposes, and therefore excludes the business sector. I am deeply concerned about the real-world impact of this type of limitation, including reports of price gouging by healthcare staffing agencies. For example, safety net hospitals in Chicago report budgeting $130 to $130 to $1.50 an hour, $1.30 to $1.50 an hour for agency nurses, with one hospital in my district paying $2 million per month. These agencies are pocketing a significant portion of what they charge for profits. Unless things change, many hospitals serving underserved communities will have to reduce their services, limiting access severely to needed health care. This is just one example of how price gouging in the business sector has a direct impact on consumers. With that in mind, do you believe that the federal price gouging legislation should address the business sector?
Yes, I share your concern deeply on the issue that you just raised. And yes, we did see issues where the government, where schools, hospitals, fire stations were trying to protect themselves by getting PPE, and even cleaning services to try to mitigate any spread of the virus. And because our statute did not apply to those types of goods or services, we were unable to make sure that they didn't pay for things that they shouldn't have paid, or paid extra money for things that they shouldn't have paid. So this bill would address that shortfall.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, you're back.
The gentleman yields back. Before I call on the next member, let me just say I'm going to have to excuse myself for a few minutes. And in the meantime, the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Cardenas, who is will chair the subcommittee virtually, and I'll be back as soon as I can. But now let me call on Mr. Upton for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I sort of wish that we had a witness from the administration here to answer some of our questions, because I got to say, and I think many of us, certainly on this side of the aisle, would agree that our economy is in a world of hurt. It's not been overnight, and I would also say that inflation is at the very top of the list. For more than a year, actually a couple years, I travel around my district, but I'm sure as everybody does on both sides of the aisle, there's not an employer out there that isn't looking for more people to work. I met with my home builders last week in Michigan. They've got a lot of folks saying, we want to build a new house, we want additions. They don't have the workers to help that. Your restaurants, your hotels now, they're not offering daily cleaning if you're going to stay there for the weekend. They'll clean it before the next guest comes if you're there for a couple of days, but they don't have the staff. Talk to the auto industry. They're looking for parts. And I've got a company in my district, they're looking for 200 auto workers just to make axles for autos. You look at chips. They had a great announcement. I talked to my colleague, Mr. Latter, next to me here, and just did a huge chip thing in Ohio last week with most of the delegation. You've got people on both sides of the aisle, from as far left as Joyce Beatty to far right as Jim Jordan. I mean, there's nobody on the outside of that flank, I don't think. The Senate passed a bill last year in June with nearly 70 votes, and we can't get a CHIPS bill on its own that we can all vote for here. Talk about the autonomous vehicle legislation. We passed that in this committee under Greg Walden, Chairman Walden. Every member voted for it here. Maybe one, maybe Justin Amash voted against it in the Senate, but he was, it passed with over 400 votes. And 4 years later, we're letting China run forward as we haven't come back with a bill. We had, despite our vote, we couldn't get it done in the Senate. Even the IRS is looking for thousands of people to process these returns that people can start sending in this last week. I can remember traveling in my district, a little town of Coloma. I think it's got 2 traffic lights. And across the street from the McDonald's, for the entire summer, there's a yard sign there. Truck washers wanted, $18 an hour. I mean, basically, you need a good pressure hose and maybe a couple of brushes to do something like that. So inflation is a big issue. And you can't drive on the highway if you pass a truck or if a truck passes you without a sign on the back of it that says, We need you. We know about those truck driver shortages. I think just yesterday I saw FedEx going to limit their priority deliveries because they don't have drivers. And this morning, I got an email from a guy that I don't know, but he said, we just learned that the FMCSA, that's the Federal Motor Service, has a new regulation going into effect on Friday, this Friday, that's going to limit the ways in which employees can earn a commercial driver's license. The new rules require all drivers to attend a 3-week or 7-weekend course, and it's going to increase the cost of earning a CDL from the current levels of $1,000 a driver to $15,000 a driver, including training costs and wages. It's going to be prohibitive for small businesses and individuals, going to exacerbate a serious shortage of the already severely limited supply of commercial drivers. Businesses like mine simply can't afford it without a sharp and immediate price increase that the market won't bear, and soon to come, deeper later shortage will limit our capacity to conduct crucial infrastructure work. Those are the stories that we need to be addressing here. You can't, and we know about energy costs. Good grief. The price at the pump is going to be $4 by spring. We have this winter that's upon us now, hitting the rest of the country. As we see these storms, it's the leading story on the news. Gas prices, natural gas prices are up 30-40% from where they were before. So our farmers need that, but so do our workers and families struggling to make ends meet. So, the idea that we're going to shut off the pipelines, that we're going to limit our efforts to identify and produce North American energy here instead of coming from overseas, all of those things tip the dominoes the wrong way as it relates to inflation and trying to get our economy back on track. So I'm sorry I didn't get any questions here. I'd like to have all of you comment, but I can see that my time has expired. So with that, I'll wave the white flag for this hearing. I just wish we had someone from the administration that could help answer some of these questions instead of the hearing that we've got today. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Next, we recognize Representative Castor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses who have appeared today. This is a very important hearing on how we can address price gouging. Price gouging is so maddening for everyone, and I hear it from my neighbors back home in the Tampa Bay area and in the state of Florida. From the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we saw these unconscionable price spikes for masks and other PPE, for medical supplies, toiletries, rapid tests, and drugs as well. In fact, a local TV station, WFTS, had a recent report of a local business selling at-home COVID tests for $50. That's double the going rate. And fortunately, the administration has addressed that with some of their free COVID testing that consumers can order. It's even the Federal Reserve Chair was asked recently, why are companies raising prices? And he said, because they can. And this practice is harmful and wrong. So I am all in on giving our consumer protection agencies the tools they need to help stop it. It's not a new phenomenon, however. Coming from the state of Florida, we see this time and time again when a tropical storm or hurricane is approaching, where scam artists pop up and they charge consumers exorbitant prices for basic goods. And the same thing is happening now during this pandemic, but seems like even those scam artists just aren't as brazen as some of the stuff that's going on right now. And Dr. Mabud, you've detailed a lot of this in your testimony, occurrences of executives trying to explain away price increases. Tell me, are these price increases you discussed related to underlying cost increases? Can legitimate reasons beyond corporate greed explain all of the price hikes we're seeing? And why do these companies believe they can raise prices without facing any consequences from customers or the law?
Thank you for that question. I'll take your sort of last point first. Some of the most flagrant profiteering we're seeing is by companies who really sell essentials, right? These are goods that families need every single day: diapers, cleaning supplies. And frankly, they can raise prices because people need these goods regardless of what the price is, and because these companies hold a lot of market share. So if Procter & Gamble has, say, 15 different brands of detergent, they can jack up prices on all of those different brands of detergent, and consumers have nowhere to go. But I think the question around input costs is also really important. Input costs are subject to the same brittle supply chain that's weakening our overall economic resiliency. We have a system where corporate executives have really prioritized a just-in-time system where there's no resiliency and redundancy built into our supply chain to help our economy weather shocks. And so we really need to invest in a system that allows companies to get inputs to their goods appropriately. We also need to stem pandemic profiteering where it's happening, which is predominantly with large companies today and in other crises that you mentioned.
Thank you very much. Ms. Frasch, how has the pandemic caused you all to look at different approaches to stem the price gouging that's going on right now?
Thank you for that question. So I think in terms of what we were seeing, typically the statute that we have in Pennsylvania is something that's very local and very geographic to a specific area. Here, we saw it across the entire Commonwealth. We saw it occurring outside the Commonwealth. And so we had to put a whole bunch of people on a task force where we typically maybe have, one or two agents and a couple of attorneys working on it because it's a specific area with limited, consumers who are being harmed, to the entire state of Pennsylvania having, these issues. And, we had to dedicate a lot of time and resources to investigate, learn, and enforce our law.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to urge my GOP colleagues to join us. Democrats have been taking action to lower costs for consumers, whether that's the cost of prescription drugs, healthcare, and Build Back Better and the American Rescue Plan, or it's building up our domestic manufacturing base through American Competes that's on the floor of the House this week. We're taking action. I really want to invite our GOP colleagues to join us in doing that as well. And I'll yield back my time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. Also, members, if you have your microphone on, whether you're on Zoom or in committee, can you please double check? We've got some horrendous background noise on right now. Sounds like somebody's moving some stuff or coughing or what have you. So somebody's mic is on. So with that, we recognize Congressman Lara for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for our witnesses for being with us today. First, I want to thank the ranking member of the subcommittee and also the ranking member of our full committee for bringing up AV, autonomous vehicles. Just real briefly again, this is legislation I sponsored back in the 115th Congress. We had over 300 meetings in this committee alone with our staff. We talked to people across the spectrum. We brought out a very good bill. We worked across the aisle, and we got unanimous support as it left this committee. Not only did it get unanimous support when it left this committee, but it was also voice voted on the floor. And as we've seen since that time, not bringing back this legislation since it went over the Senate, unfortunately we couldn't get it over and get it done there, that foreign entities across the world are out there being able to get ahead of us in this, and we want to make sure that the United States is the one bringing this forth, this technology. And it was also brought up about what's happening on our highways. The latest statistic, the horrible statistic that just came out, 31,720 people were killed through the third quarter of this past year, and this number is not going down, it's going up. But with that, I think we need to be addressing it and getting it going again as soon as possible. Dr. Ritchie, if I could start my questioning with you. According to a December Small Business Optimum survey, almost a quarter of small businesses said that inflation is the greatest problem in operating their business. Small businesses in particular are not able to absorb supply chain disruptions, as well as causing them to charge higher prices to their consumers and customers. And, you know, in your testimony, which I found interesting when I was reading it, you brought out a couple of points here. You say, my concern is that coming out of the pandemic, nearly every company in the country will be able to show additional costs, loss of control, negative impacts on profit, lost sales, and/or other types of risks incurred through the supply chain, including acquisition, production, distribution, and sales. You go on to say, it is important to remember that prices move with the market and across supply chain transactions. And I realize that because I've got over 80,000, according to the national manufacturers, over 80,000 manufacturing jobs in my district. And over the last week and a half, when I was back in Ohio, going in and out of businesses everywhere, I heard the same thing. Can't find employees, energy costs going up, transportation costs going up, material costs going up. The American Truckers Association put out their survey saying that they need 80,000 truck drivers right now because of the shortage. So with that, Dr. Ritchie, you know, what in your research, what is the impact of the current supply chain crisis on small businesses?
Yeah, it's all of those different things, which are quite dramatic and quite difficult on small business, starting with the scarcity that's been created by supply chain issues and trying to get the product into the country. But we've also had the issue with labor. Certainly those inputs, getting people to the job and actually being able to drive the vehicles and do what's appropriate is a difficult thing to deal with as well. All of these inputs drive inflation up in this country, right? And so price gouging could be a component, but when you think about labor costs, when you think about inputs like parts being scarce, the price is going up. When you think about business partners are having to raise prices to some degree to cover fixed costs that they have invested in already, it's unfortunately kind of natural to see these prices increase. Obviously, it has the hardest impact on small business. And so, you know, the legislation will have to be quite careful uncovering, you know, what is really a price gouging situation and what is just a natural need to increase prices to make sure that a small business can remain viable.
Well, with my last 58 seconds, let me follow up with something else you have in your testimony that I found rather interesting. And I think my colleague, Mr. Upton from Michigan, is bringing some of this up. You mentioned on page 3 of your testimony, adding the government to supply chains is highly likely to add touches, processes, time, and costs. What's the who, what, where, when, and how on that?
Yeah, so that type of discussion goes back to the von Mises work of the 1950s that shows that government intervention raises prices when they get involved in business relationships. You know, maybe the relationship between bringing your in-laws to come live at your home shows the complexity that's created when that happens. And the same type thing happens in the supply chain. It also can drive trust out of relationships and cause relationships to dissolve. So that's kind of what I'm getting at there, and hopefully I cleared that up a little.
Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
I just want to clarify for the record, I don't think the federal government has ever forced anybody to have in-laws. I just want to hope people didn't misunderstand that comment. Little levity, people, amongst all the noise. Not the noise of the comment, but this background noise is driving me nuts.
What is that?
Anyway, next, the gentleman yields back. Next, we recognize Congressman McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair, thank the witnesses. Great hearing this morning. Mr. Harmon, currently 39 states, including my state of California, have authority to enforce against price gouging during emergencies or disasters. You state that most states have a law against price gouging during the declared emergency, but laws vary very widely. How do the differences and limitations in state authority hinder our recovery from the pandemic?
So I think the inability of the FTC to investigate nationwide price gouging, so when you have a manufacturer raising prices across the country, it's much easier to look at that and figure out where there's cost increase, where there is versus where there is a price gouging. And for a state, that is much harder to see. The state price gouging laws, as has been mentioned, we're really focused on localized emergencies and localized price gouging. And what we've seen in the pandemic is widespread national price gouging. And while there are investigations and while there is enforcement, as the other witnesses has detailed, you really can't get at the core problem that is now, as I mentioned, normalizing. And we're seeing it in so many more sectors and categories than just the pandemic-related PPE type things we saw initially.
Well, do you think that online sellers may take what they've learned from the pandemic price gouging onto consumers in the future after the pandemic ends?
Oh, 100%. It is a business practice that works, and we're now seeing the other retailers and traditional retailers and manufacturers mirror it in their pricing.
You know, it could be argued that corporations are just doing their job to maximize profits by price gouging. You could make that argument, right? So what does that tell you about the current corporate structure, about the current corporate model we have in this country?
We are suffering a crisis of corporate concentration in every sector across the economy. Dr. Mabud mentioned Procter & Gamble having 15 different detergents. And in every sector, you find that there are, even when there are multiple brands and names, it is really just a handful of companies controlling what we buy, and that affects consumers, obviously. It also affects the small businesses who are attempting to compete with them, but also serving as their vendors.
But what's the solution?
There's a lot of solutions. I think price gouging legislation is one of them, so we can investigate where this particular harm is. But we really need to focus on where there is consolidation that shouldn't be happening, and that is also work the FTC needs to do.
Well, how do state laws fail to provide authority to police pandemic price gouging by online platforms?
They're trying, right? And this is a new type of price gouging in the sense that we have a national emergency, and that is fairly novel. Early on in the pandemic, Kentucky brought a case against online sellers, and they ultimately prevailed. But the challenge against that really challenged the core of state law was, can a state price gouging law dictate the prices nationally? And that is how online sales work, right? Even if you're in the state setting the price, it is a national price. And again, they ultimately prevailed, but that really casts doubt on how state laws, in the absence of a federal law, can address this problem.
Thank you. Dr. Mabud, each week I hear from small businesses in my district that continue to face an uncertain future while corporate executives and shareholders enjoy record profits. How would a federal price gouging law benefit small business owners who are still fighting to overcome losses incurred?
Yes, I mean, it's absolutely critical to take on bad actors in the market to support small businesses. Small businesses are often some of the entities in the market that are most affected by price gouging, particularly upstream. So if you consider U.S. Steel, the third largest steel producer in the U.S., recently reported that they are raising prices that go beyond their input costs, right? Imagine the impact on your local bike shop, right? A small business owner who is facing higher input costs, who is seeing their profit margins decrease, and all good conscience, even though they're not behaving badly, having to pass those prices on to the consumer. And so really, small businesses are getting crushed by corporate price gouging in the same way that consumers are.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Cardenas, for chairing. And now, Mr. Guthrie, it's yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. And Kentucky did have price gouging laws and successful, and you've seen a lot of it where people are hoarding products and selling on the internet. And you're looking at the corporate side. I know Kroger has been brought up and the profits from Kroger. But if you tell people they can't go out to eat, then grocery stores are going to have more volume and make more money. So the question is, are they price gouging or are they just, I know their profits have gone up. Where is it price gouging? And one good example, I remember, I have a lot of, they're fewer now, but dairies in my district, and dairies were pouring out milk while you couldn't get milk at the grocery store. And of course, as they're bringing to my attention, I want to get to the bottom of it, and started asking around and finding out around. And the problem was a good portion of milk, I forget the percentages, but I talked to people in the milk industry, went to institutions. So they went to schools, we shut schools down, they went to universities, we shut universities down, and there weren't enough gallon jugs. That was a problem, the kind of things that you sell at a grocery store. So on the face of it, you would see on the news people dumping milk because you can't store it long enough. And it was a supply chain issue. It wasn't somebody purposely trying to gouge or move forward. And so those are the things that we have to be careful of. When people go out and buy all the hand sanitizer they can buy and try to corner the market on hand sanitizer and sell it to you online, that's one thing. But I would just like to see an example, since Kroger's been brought up, of them price gouge. I have 3 in my town, and I will certainly do whatever I can to point out where they're price gouging, where that is, not just that they're. And the opposite side of it, I can show you a lot of restaurant owners who were not profitable in the last couple of years. And so it moves forward. I want to talk to Dr. Ritchie. And one thing, and I heard that Kroger decreased wages. I think that was, I think Kroger's, in my area, it's represented by a bargaining unit. And I'll tell you, they have signs up everywhere for work. So I would like to see the data on that if that's possible. But Dr. Ritchie, you're talking about just trying to find workers. I know the Kroger that I go to in our area, Meijer, since Peter Meyer's in Congress, we have a Meijer in my area, go there as well, and Walmart, so I'll just hit them all. And they're all looking for workers. And so the question is, Dr. Ritchie, there's been several, I think some panelists here that talk about expanding and increasing unemployment benefits. How has that affected the supply chain, the increased unemployment benefits, and what would happen if we expanded the unemployment benefits with the federal bonuses, of which I think I voted for in the original because of the whole economy was shut down, but now that we're looking for workers, how would that affect it?
Yeah, well, first let me point out that we are definitely looking for workers, and it's a big problem, and they're across the country. People are saying, where do the workers go? And so we're hopeful to see those folks come back. We had an interesting situation going on around the holidays this year, right, where we had a number of vehicles that were trapped off the coast. We had poor flow of product across the United States. We had truck drivers that weren't able to come to work and move that product, and we had already had a problem with that level of capacity overall. At the same time, we had a lot of money dumped into the system, right, to try to help people that were unable to make money. And we also had opportunities to encourage them to pre-buy or purchase early or panic buy based on their concerns or on worry that they weren't going to get their holiday gifts. That combination of kind of an economic stimulus while the supply chain was stopped created a dramatic disruption, and we're still shaking that out today. So we need to really ask questions about whether or not doing something like that would exacerbate the situation and make it even worse.
Do you think that it would? I mean, you said ask the question, so I guess you think that it would?
I would say until there's a break in some of these different points where ports or the trucks, I think that adding increasing demand would make it worse.
Okay, just related, but just a little separate. I know you talked to AEI on the blockchain technology, so I know our committee's interested in that. So blockchain technology got many applications, including increasing privacy and data security. Would you highlight your conversation with AEI on how blockchains can assist supply chain management? I have about 30 seconds. Can you elaborate on how this technology can be beneficial for supply chain management in 30 seconds?
Yeah, what it lets you diversify and move all of your information to a digital platform that makes it available to all of the members of the supply chain. It also allows those transactions to be governed by the members of the supply chain. So if something nefarious happens, like price gouging, you'd be able to see it across the blockchain. So we're still in the early stages of implementing that. Some companies are testing it out, but it's a great opportunity. We'll see if we can get it moving as rapidly as we need it.
Thank you. My time's expired, and I yield back. I appreciate your answer.
Okay. Mr. Cardenas, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you so much for having this hearing, and also to the ranking member, Bill Arakis. I want to thank both of you. This is a very important hearing and very informative for all of us. Time and time again throughout this pandemic, we've seen the most vulnerable communities among us suffer the most, while the wealthy find a way to make it through without the devastating fallout that others receive. COVID-19 has highlighted glaring inequalities in our society, and when the wealthy exploit that for profit, we in Congress cannot turn a blind eye. I want to thank you, Madam Chairwoman, again for introducing this legislation. No legislation is perfect, but we shouldn't wait for the perfect to make sure that we protect the American people from exploitation. Dr. Mabud, in your testimony, you described the willingness of some corporations to take advantage of the steady demand for basic household items like diapers and household cleaning supplies, even in the face of price hikes. These items are not luxuries, they're necessities. As an economist, can you speak to the impact that targeting basic products like these is having on Americans' low-income communities?
Yes, thank you for that really important question. Low-income communities, especially communities of color, are disproportionately affected by price gouging. Higher prices, particularly on essentials, just simply eat up a bigger proportion of already strapped household budgets. We know that low-income communities are more likely to be communities of color and therefore are feeling the effects of price gouging more acutely. The other thing to remember is that these workers, by definition, are low income, right? They are having a hard time accessing good jobs in the labor market. They might be facing discrimination or occupational segregation and other barriers to labor market entry. So low-income folks, particularly low-income folks of color, are really hit from all sides. They have rising prices at the checkout line, and they have a harder time accessing good, well-paid jobs.
Well, thank you. So right now, during a pandemic, we have some folks who are working 2 and 3 jobs, maybe a single parent, and needing to buy diapers. You mentioned that being one of the products that seem to have gone up in price, while it appears that some of the companies that actually provide those essential products are actually making larger profit margins. How do we reconcile that? Is it really a supply chain issue, or is it, as you mentioned, quote, tailored price increases, which is what one of the C-suite executives was explaining? Was it during some kind of meeting of their shareholders or something?
I mean, simply put, this is corporate greed, right? These companies have enormous market power. They have the dominance to set prices on goods across the market because they are so big. And the companies, like, the ones that sell diapers, are selling products that people need, and they know that, right? The point about price elasticity essentially refers to a consumer's responsiveness to prices. And when you have essential goods, consumers are not responsive to price increases because they are essential. And so what we're seeing now is simply these big corporations taking advantage of the most vulnerable at a point where they're at their most vulnerable, and padding their profits. I mean, that's the other point here. Like, these CEOs, these corporate executives, these shareholders are just raking it in, all while consumers are paying more for essential goods at the checkout line.
Thank you. In your testimony, you also touched on the pain being felt by small business owners who must compete with giant companies like Walmart and Amazon for inventory. You reference a quote by one small business owner who said that his contracts for inventory were, quote, not worth the paper they were written on. Can you describe how these large firms are using their size to crowd out small businesses when it comes to getting their products to their shelves?
Yes, big businesses are able to negotiate prices better than small businesses, right? That's simply because of their market power. So one example from the latest issue of the American Prospect is Walmart in town is able to negotiate $1 boxes of Duncan Hines cake mix, which is the most popular cake mix in the area. The local grocery store, on the other hand, can only manage to squeeze out a seasonal discount that brings the price of these cake mixes down to $1.32. So in that case, when that small business can't push around using its power the prices that it can sell its products for in the store, how can you expect that small business to compete? So it's really important to, in order to have a thriving small business community, we have to tackle the power that these mega corporations have over prices.
Dr. Mahmoud, I only have 20 seconds. So I have a question. Has history borne out that when larger companies squeeze out smaller competitors, that once the smaller competitors are off the playing field, that the larger companies tend to increase their prices regardless of what the market can bear.
Absolutely, and my colleague on the panel can speak to Amazon, which does this frequently.
Thank you very much. My time is expired. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Bouchant, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I don't support price gouging. However, I'm finding it hard not to point out the hypocrisy in front of us today. The Hoosiers I represent aren't paying more at the pump or more on their everyday groceries because of price gouging. They're paying more because of inflation. This legislation won't restock the barren grocery store shelves or car lots scattered throughout my district and the country. These problems originate from larger market factors and COVID, of course, and the Biden administration's failure to address these problems is only adding fuel to the fire. Indiana is currently bracing for a heavy snowstorm today, with temperatures dropping rapidly, and most Hoosiers are going to be left wondering how they will pay for their heating bill. But instead of looking at solutions that will help lower energy costs, Democrats in Washington are attempting to add even more taxation in their massive Build Back Better bill that would increase each household's heating bill by $242 a year. Not to mention the fact the Biden administration continues to block the creation of pipelines that would help lower energy prices and terminating oil and gas leases on public lands in the U.S., ironically, while asking OPEC to send us more oil and then improperly tapping our strategic oil reserve because the American people are noticing the prices going up. You really can't make this stuff up. My point being, I wish we'd get serious and look at the real problems so that we can come up with real solutions. Running to the FTC to investigate gas prices every time they go up isn't a serious exercise, and it only ignores the real problem. Advancing policies that promote energy independence and production at home is a real solution. Supporting policies that incentivize people to get back to work is a real solution. I hope this committee doesn't get too distracted by today's hearing that it forgets to pay attention to the real issue of why our constituents are paying more for everyday items, and that is inflation. It's a good try by the majority to try to change the narrative. Unfortunately, the American people, I think, know the facts. Dr. Ritchie, a question for you. I do not believe that the legislation before us today adequately factors in the effects that overly burdensome government regulations and policies have on price increases. This is something the FTC and state AGs must adequately consider when determining if price gouging has occurred. Because again, what we're seeing today is in response to inflation, not price gouging. Dr. Ritchie, do you believe it is important to consider key factors such as labor shortages, government interference, and other market factors when determining if price gouging is occurring or not?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it's absolutely something that should be considered. Certainly, I would like to look at research on labor costs that show that they're not having an impact on price. I can tell you that anecdotal evidence talking to truck driving companies, manufacturers, wholesalers, and distribution businesses, their prices are being increased because of the dollar figures that they're placing on labor. Now, in some places, you may see that reduced because they can't get the people to come to work and pay them. And in that instance, the product's not going to flow through the system. There are a number of different things that impact inflation, and you touched on some of those things there. Moving money into the economy from the government doesn't. Restriction on distribution causes scarcity, what doesn't. Labor cost cause that issue as well. And even though it's nice to receive a higher pay rate, we should expect to see prices increase as those pay scales go up.
Thank you. Would the factors I laid out and you just talked about be referenced anywhere in this legislation?
I don't believe they are, sir. No, sir.
Do you think that leaving language vague for what qualifies as grossly, for example, would further enable the FTC to be used as a political tool that targets the administration's chosen enemy of the day, corporate America?
Well, yeah, that's tough to answer, but I would say that there's a lot going on. There are a lot of dynamics here, and I'm not certain this is the key issue. I try to get executives and students to focus on core issues, root causes of these things, And I feel like this is not a root cause, it's an effect of the other things that we see out there in the marketplace.
Thank you very much. I recently was at the Port of LA and saw some of the problems there. And in fairness, there is a labor shortage there for a variety of reasons, and COVID is still a factor, no doubt. But it's a difficult problem, but we certainly need to be offering real solutions and not having hearings trying to cast blame at our free market economy. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now I invite Congresswoman Dingell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, all of the witnesses for testifying today. I do think that this is an important hearing because we all remember how early in the pandemic, toilet paper, hand sanitizer, PPE, and other essentials saw skyrocketing prices amid consumers' immediate panic in preventing the spread of COVID-19. In 2020, the Michigan Attorney General's office received 4,522 price gouging complaints. And this was the first time price gouging made the top 10 of the most frequent consumer complaints in the state. As we continue to grapple with the impacts of the pandemic, consumers and their families are still struggling. I agree that inflation is real with my colleague, but they're struggling with rising prices for common household goods amidst a robust economic recovery, and corporations are posting record profits. It is the responsibility of Congress to ensure that corporations are not taking advantage of consumers during this emergency to increase their profit margins through price gouging. So I want to talk about the downstream supply chain impacts. One of my concerns is the impact of price gouging within the supply chain and its impact on downstream prices, much of what falls ultimately on the consumer. Dr. Mabud, in your testimony, you highlight how price gouging further up in the supply chain can force small businesses to pass on price increases to the consumer due to higher production or other input costs. Can you go into the additional details on how this practice disproportionately hurts smaller businesses?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, given the extreme consolidation in product markets, bigger companies simply have power to set prices in a way that smaller businesses don't. And that power is in many ways magnified when those big businesses are sitting higher up on the supply chain and passing those prices, those input costs down to smaller businesses. You know, the owner of Country Fresh Farm Markets, a local grocery store in Cincinnati, confirmed that he was being able to force to sacrifice his own margins entirely because of the prices that big businesses like Procter & Gamble are setting. And as mentioned before, when we see the input costs of goods like, as input costs of things like steel go up, that has deep implications for small businesses across the country that rely on those inputs for their own goods and their own well-being.
So, Dr. Mabud, would addressing supply chain bottlenecks, such as critical funding for semiconductors and increasing domestic manufacturing capacity, help to prevent price increases further up in the supply chain from translating into higher costs for small businesses and consumers?
Short answer is yes. We are living in a world where we've turned our supply chains over to big corporations. They have really maximized short-term returns. These companies have essentially carved away at our supply chains until what we're left with right now is this brittle knife edge system. And so small businesses are completely at the mercy of a system that can be thrown out of whack by something as simple as a storm halfway across the world or a COVID outbreak in a factory. So investing in our supply chain, ensuring that we have redundancy and domestic capacity for key pieces of our supply chain will help ease bottlenecks and create a more predictable and reliable system for small businesses, which sets them up for success.
So I'm down to about a minute. So I'm going to ask Dr. Mabud, Mr. Harmon, Mr. Frasch, and ask you to be short, yes or no. Would addressing supply chain vulnerabilities through the America Competes Act alleviate some of these issues, yes or no? Start with Dr. Mabud.
Yes, it would alleviate some of these pressures.
Mr. Harmon?
It likely would, yes.
Ms. Frasch?
Yes, it likely would.
So I want to thank you again for all of the witnesses being here today, and to Chairwoman Schakowsky for holding this important hearing. Congress has to take immediate action to address gaps in our supply chain that are having a crippling effect on our economy and leave consumers vulnerable to predatory business practices. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic and future emergencies, this has life consequences. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my 19 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Dunn, it is your opportunity to ask questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the important issue of rising prices across America today. You know, my constituents constantly express how out of control inflation across all goods and all services is affecting their daily lives. It's clear that all of our members hear the same thing from their districts as well. As members of Congress, we have a responsibility to address and reverse the economic trend which was caused, frankly, by this administration's failed policies. We all know price gouging can be a serious issue, especially during states of emergency. However, when we study the issues facing today's economy, we must consider all of the factors that are contributing to the price increases in our nation over the last 12 to 18 months. We have the worst inflation in nearly 40 years. It's destroying the purchasing power of everyday Americans. We can't allow uninformed policy to make this problem even worse. So to Dr. Ritchie, you described our supply chain as struggling to meet demand, yet the Biden administration continues to push more federal spending, which leads to increased demand. I want to focus on the other contributing factor here, the pressure on the supply chains, labor shortages. President Biden's ineffective vaccine mandates have exacerbated the labor shortages, putting upward pressure on inflation. Our federal government is hurting our nation's suppliers just as they try to get back on track. So, Dr. Ritchie, can you briefly describe how a workforce which has been incentivized to not work, and even highly skilled workers are being driven out of work, how does that contribute to rising prices? Dr. Ritchie.
Yeah, certainly that's a major issue. Getting labor back to work has been a problem, of course, over the entire pandemic. I can tell you in our scenario here with undergraduate students, our students come back from their internship in the summertime before their senior year, and 75% of them already have a job. Those options are out there and they're everywhere. Without people in those positions, you can't move product, right? You can't get enough supply to meet demand in those different marketplaces. And so that's going to have a significant impact on price because those companies have to cover cost.
You're right. So I agree with you. I asked the question because so many other companies are, in fact, mandating their employees to get vaccinated in order to return to work, or worse, they're terminating them if they aren't vaccinated. So labor shortages do affect supply chains and cause prices to rise. Let me just, on a side note, say I have a fondness for Auburn in my heart there, Dr. Ritchie. I have a son who's a physicist, graduated from there, and so War Eagle, right? Another question for you, though. We know short supply combined with increased demand contributes to inflation, but we're missing an opportunity this week to do something about that. China has this 2025 plan to grow industry, but we're pushing policies that restrict production in energy, transportation, and labor sectors, while simultaneously pushing enormous federal spending and easy monetary policies. Do you believe reducing the federal spending and providing appropriate regulatory relief would help alleviate the ongoing strain on supply chains?
Yeah, I definitely think that regulatory relief will help. That's one of the things that makes it difficult for product to move and adds cost to our system. Certainly what we see going on in the Port of LA and Port of Los Angeles is an example of those restrictions that are making things difficult to move. And so if we can find some way to reduce those regulations, which to some degree those ports have, it'll help things move in that direction. We also see regulations around truck driving. Certainly in California, it's quite difficult to get into that market if you're an independent contractor. Independent contractors choose to be their own bosses. They don't want to be part of major corporations, and they're choosing not to go into California for that reason because of the laws that exist there. That takes about 20% of the truck drivers out of the picture to move product out of California.
So to that point, I think we all know that the Producer's Price Index, I want to focus on that just for the last few seconds. The Producer's Price Index, which is the wholesale version, if you will, of the CPI, Consumer Price Index, it's up almost 10% year on year. You know, and this spells a structural inflation for our country that I think has nothing to do with price gouging, and nor is it a transitory problem with inflation. I appreciate the time to look into this today, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the hearing witnesses for joining us.
Gentleman yields back, and now I recognize Congresswoman Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Schakowsky, for holding this hearing, and to the witnesses for appearing today. It's hard to get the beginning of the pandemic when toilet paper and hand sanitizer were precious commodities. Shelves were cleared out and purchases were limited. Unfortunately, disasters often magnify social inequality and disproportionately fall on minority communities, as the Department of Consumer and Worker Protections in New York City found last year in their report on price gouging. Dr. Mabud, what are some underlying economic conditions that make some communities more vulnerable to price gouging?
Simply put, price gouging affects lower income communities disproportionately because it eats up a larger proportion of their budgets. You know, families, whether you're rich or poor, you need a diaper, but that diaper is a bigger part of your budget if you have a child. And so that's one of the key factors that's really harming communities, low-income communities right now.
And thank you for that. Price gouging after emergencies is often a local problem where local enforcement agencies are best suited to address it. That's why it's critical that federal price gouging legislation serves as a baseline of protection for people while allowing states to keep their existing authority to go after profiteers. Mr. Frasch, as someone who has brought price gouging cases during the COVID-19 pandemic and witnessed consumer harm up close, do you agree that additional enforcement tools from federal gouging legislation would help your office protect the people of your state?
Yes. Currently, our Price Gouging Act doesn't even have protection over Pennsylvania. And so any federal legislation to give us authority to enforce would certainly bring more protection to Pennsylvania. And then also having the FTC as a partner would be helpful as well.
And how would this ensure that existing state authorities are complemented but not weakened in any way?
I believe the way that the bill is proposed allows for both the state enforcement tool to continue while having this additional tool for those states who don't have enforcement authority, or at least to have a floor that would be across the board for all the states and the FTC.
Also, your testimony highlighted some limitations of Pennsylvania's existing price gouging law. Can you cite some specific examples of cases or types of cases your office could not bring or could not consider bringing because of these limitations?
Correct. So like I mentioned earlier, anytime that we receive tips from a fire company or from a hospital or from a school or a government agency who is trying to get PPE for their staff or to supply for, for their well-being, we were unable to apply our state price gouging law to that particular transaction.
And then having the authority of this law, that would have changed your assessment of these matters?
That's correct.
And lastly, your testimony talks about how important it is to prevent price gouging before it occurs. In your experience, do you believe in the authority to seek civil penalties in price gouging cases is an effective deterrent?
Yes. In most cases, we did not seek significant penalties. We believe that, when we sent out cease and desist letters and the threat of a penalty to continue price gouging deterred that continued conduct. So having a penalty in our toolbox certainly is helpful. but it doesn't mean that it necessarily will apply. And I do believe that it did deter quite a lot of price gouging in Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. And now, Ms. Lesko, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This mask that I was just wearing was made in China. This is the mask that was provided to us from the U.S. House of Representatives. And then the test kits, the COVID home test kits that taxpayers paid for and are shipped out to Americans is also made in China. And so, Dr. Ritchie, since you're an expert on supply chain issues, I was hoping you could tell me if you have any ideas of how America can be less reliant on China.
Oh, sure, absolutely I can, and thanks for that question. You know, over the years, we have seen a transition to a more efficient system that was based on low cost, and that system definitely moved a healthy amount of manufacturing to China. I can tell you over the last year or so, we've been spending significant amount of time with Accenture and other groups trying to put together educational systems that'll help managers understand risk of sourcing from a single location. So what I mean by that is that the tools that we've developed teach them to think about an international source of supply that can keep costs down. Think about a near sourcing option, perhaps Latin America and that region, that could make the product nearer and be competitive. And then also think about a domestic source of supply, setting up a 3-set system so that you have the different suppliers competing against each other and a fallback on those different players. The reality is companies like Toyota that instigated the just-in-time management system have now stepped away from those things, and the supply chain is naturally moving as a unit to more responsive approaches. So that's what we should expect to see over the next few years, and it's already in play across a number of industries.
Thank you. And Dr. Ritchie, I have another question for you. Can you give me any examples, you've mentioned some already, of how the Biden administration's policies are actually making it worse? The supply chain issues, inflation, price increases. Can you name any? I'm thinking one is maybe their energy policy and how they're so adversary to oil and gas and how that is increasing prices here in America.
Yeah, certainly the energy policy has increased prices significantly. Remember, manufacturing has to pay for energy, then the truck drivers have to pay for increased energy prices. The customer has to pay for increased energy prices. And if you think about companies like in automotive, you think about tires, that product includes petroleum in the product itself, and then it includes petroleum in the manufacturing, and the energy related to manufacturing, and in the transportation. So as those prices of oil and gas go up, it's a multi-level hit on these businesses. That is one of the key components that's driving inflation in the marketplace today. And it was one of the first steps that the Biden administration made. I've asked and been a proponent of saying we should get all in on energy. We should be doing a lot of exploring with the fossil fuels and be trying to use that fossil fuel exploration to pay for these additional types of energy that we're trying to find to move away from fossil fuels.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to conclude with, I guess, a statement. I know that one of our witnesses is Dr. Mabud, and I read an article in the New York Times that quoted her, and it said something about and that's exactly why this fear-mongering around inflation is proving so effective, as if people are using fear-mongering inflation, and maybe I interpreted it wrong, but it doesn't seem to me that our constituents are fear-mongering inflation. It's real. This is real. Prices are going up. I don't know about my colleagues, but here in Washington, D.C., when I went to the Whole Foods and the Navy Yard, the shelves were empty. Some of the shelves were empty. There was no milk. And when I went back home to Arizona, certain items, they're very mysterious, like pasta. Pasta was out of stock. I mean, this is some real problems. Prices are going up, and it's not fear-mongering, it's real. And with that, I yield back.
And next is Mr. Soto, who has been here for the whole time of the subcommittee, which I appreciate, and it's 5 minutes for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier this term, we passed the American Rescue Plan to put shots in arms, money in pockets, and it stopped another Great Recession. In Florida, our unemployment is under 4% now, and foreclosures just came in lower this year. Our community was decimated by foreclosures because Congress went too small during the Great Recession with the American Reinvestment Act. We went big and we stopped devastation from happening in our community. And then we passed the bipartisan infrastructure framework, which, according to Republican Senator Rob Portman, is counterinflationary. And we're already seeing money coming down to our communities. I want to thank the members on this committee who voted for it. A few of you did, a lot of you didn't, and I guess you'll have to explain that to your constituents. And now I agree. We have a bipartisan agreement that we need to boost domestic manufacturing, microchips, technology like telecommunications and others. We're going to have this great bill called the Competes Act up. The AFL-CIO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce support it. I hope you do too. We had nearly 20 Republicans supporting it in the Senate. So maybe we'll get everybody coming together to increase our domestic production, or maybe we won't. I guess we'll find out this week. Today we're here to discuss COVID-caused inflation due to price gouging. Inflation is happening across the world. Factories, transportation, raw materials, workers are getting sick. They go home, and everything becomes slower, less efficient because of this pandemic. Some price increases are related to this. Still other companies didn't have major increases, and they used the pandemic as an opportunity to raise prices. You don't have to take my word for it. CEOs across the nation have literally said this to shareholders. And so we have to look at grocery stores, oil companies, PPE manufacturers, which I appreciate our colleagues bringing that up as 3 examples of price gouging that we know is happening. So the COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act is before us today. We are acting on inflation in this committee when it's unconscionably excessive price gouging and using public health emergencies to increase prices unreasonably. And President Biden had mentioned, think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for. We're hearing a lot of complaining about inflation in this committee. Join us to help solve it. Today we have legislation. Today we have an opportunity to reduce inflation. And we're asking you to join us and actually do something about it rather than hem and haw and nitpick. And so that's why we're here today. And it'd be great to hear from you, Mr. Harmon. We've heard the FTC is cracking down on oil and gas companies for illegally increasing their prices. President Biden took the important step of announcing a release of 50 million barrels of oil, increasing production. Would the COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act help us reduce price gouging at the pump, Mr. Harmon?
Yes, the investigation that they are conducting gives us, or the president asked them to conduct, gives us the information about whether or not there's price gouging, but they don't have any authority to do anything, and this legislation is necessary to give them that authority.
And what about at the grocery stores?
It's the same. It covers the FTC, gives them that power, but it also gives states that power where they either have a limited price gouging statute or have no price gouging statute.
So they're gathering the information, but the COVID-19 Price Gouging Prevention Act is the sword to actually do something about it, to actually cut inflation. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you so much. Now yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. And Mr. Pence, Thank you for waiting, and it is now your turn.
Thank you,
5
Chair
minutes.
Chakowski and Ranking Member Bilirakis for holding this hearing today and the witnesses for being here. Wow. We're attacking inflation by fixing prices of all these American companies. You know, I spent over 30 years in the retail and wholesale distribution industry, and my state of Indiana has had price gouging legislature. And as Dr. Ritchie stated in his opening remarks, price gouging happens at the local level. In all my life, it's been my observation that it always happened at the retail, in small communities, done by small players. You know, HR 675 defies the economics of supply and demand. I've spent a lot of time in education, taking economics courses. There's some PhDs here that seem to be disregarding what I learned in school. I believe this bill is an attempt by the Democrats to deflect their responsibility for aggravating the inflation that we've been dealing with during the pandemic. And what we're talking about today with 675 is an attempt to start fixing prices at retail and wholesale across this country from Washington, D.C., because we know better here in Washington, D.C. Since all of my economic classes discuss the principles of price elasticity, I'm disappointed how this bill is seen as a solution. Price elasticity is ultimately a result of supply and demand, and a number of you witnesses know that very well. Having said that, can each of you answer a question for me? If the prices have been going up by the control of the companies and not inflation, why have these companies that have been accused of price gouging not raised prices before the pandemic? Why didn't they raise them before if they can just do it right now? Dr. Mabud, you first, quickly.
Yeah, companies have power to hike prices in a crisis precisely because they have so much control over the system. And they're able to exploit the situation where there is a crisis and people are vulnerable to take advantage of that and hike prices on consumers.
So the grocery store or the gas station across the street or across town can't kind of lower it if their competitor is just being opportunistic. Mr. Harmon, what do you think?
Well, we saw with online sellers, Amazon in particular, prices went up with price gouging because they could, because people were buying online and not going to the local store.
So there was more demand and they could increase price. Of course, as you well know, on Amazon, there was a lot of wait time because they actually didn't have the supply.
That was part of it, but they...
Part of it? No, we're talking about that
they,
it's price gouging.
Right.
That has increased, you're suggesting here today with HR 675 that it's price gouging alone that has caused inflation.
Amazon itself banned 6,000 users in March 2020 for price gouging. I mean, they themselves identified it as the problem on their platform.
Okay, so actually companies regulate and manage that because it's not very competitive when that happens, right?
Well,
so supply and demand will regulate itself so they have more supply. Dr. Ritchie, how would you answer this?
I think the way I would answer it is a little bit differently. I think when we look at the different companies that have been discussed today in this hearing, and we talk about them as price gougers, whether they're mega corporations or multinationals, we are neglecting to look at the fact that these are the businesses that stayed open during the pandemic, unlike small businesses and competitors that were required to shut down, and that they were also able to leverage e-commerce better than small business and mid-sized business in the country. So you would expect that their gross profitability would have improved, and that's what we're seeing, not price gouging.
Right, and let me just close with this. So back home, my manufacturers and retailers are saying they no longer have the ability, since the PPI, which was mentioned earlier, is outstripping the CPI. They no longer have the ability to pass on prices, and their profits are going down rapidly in the last 2 months. We saw retail went down in December, and we saw in Europe today that inflation is roaring. It's not price gouging, folks. It's just inflation. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and last but certainly not least, for 5 minutes, I call on Representative Fletcher for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Schakowsky, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Billirakis for organizing today's hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for offering your expertise and spending your time with us today. This hearing has been very illuminating, as well as your written testimony. And I want to follow up on a couple of things. I think it is important to note at the end of this hearing that this Congress and the last Congress have taken a number of steps to mitigate the damages of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the health and economic impacts. And today's focus on the impacts on consumers is another really important effort in addressing the challenges that people are facing across the country. And we have come a long way since March of 2020, but we also know we're not finished with COVID-19 yet. And the economic impacts are still being felt, from shipping delays to increased costs of food and fuel and healthcare products, many of the things we've been discussing throughout this hearing. Some of the COVID essentials, like tests and masks, are prohibitively expensive for people nationwide, and we're making great strides, right, with the recent efforts to make them available, sending test kits out, delivering masks across the country. These efforts from the administration are hugely important. But one of the things that I've been focused on since the pandemic began is access to and the cost of testing and the importance of testing. Dr. Mabud, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the Binax Now COVID-19 at-home rapid tests at some providers nearly doubled in price after a deal between those retailers and the Biden administration expired in December of last year. We've also seen providers charging just a wide range of prices for COVID tests. And I know this is something my constituents are focused on, concerned about. We also know that the highly contagious Omicron variant has spread across the U.S. and that the demand for testing is getting higher and higher as we see these record case numbers. So in this Congress and in the last Congress, I introduced the Stop COVID-19 Surprise Medical Bills Act to better understand the widely varying costs of COVID-19 tests by different providers, by requiring HHS to survey and report on the prices of testing services in order to help identify outliers. And Dr. Mabud, I was hoping you could explain why free or low price COVID tests are necessary for a strong economic recovery, and how understanding the challenges that we see and the disparity in pricing and testing may relate to that. If you could share your thoughts on that with us, that would be very helpful.
Sure. I mean, in the midst of a global unprecedented pandemic, ensuring access to affordable or free testing and PPE is absolutely vital to keep our economy going, because our economy is fundamentally at its best when we are at our best, right? And that means addressing health concerns. And that means addressing, all the barriers that workers and families are facing in contributing to our economy, whether that's childcare or testing. And so for essential workers putting their health at risk every day, or for parents who have children in school and are worried about transmission, masks and at-home tests are an important backstop to prevent the spread of the virus. And in doing so, they're an important backstop to a healthy economy that really supports all of us.
Thanks for that. And I've got about a minute and a half left, so I'd love to direct my next question to you and then open it up to anyone else. And if I run out of time, would love to get any additional responses in the record. But I think it's a good way to close this hearing and saying, how would empowering federal and state agencies to enforce against pandemic price gouging ensure that those crucial COVID-related supplies like masks and tests that you were just talking about that are so necessary to our economic recovery, how would empowering them ensure that those supplies are available to all Americans?
A clear federal standard that ensures that consumers across the country, no matter where they live, no matter what state they live in, are able to be protected from price gouging, especially for essentials in a global pandemic, is a really clear and straightforward way of ensuring that we do have a healthy economy and that people are able to access the goods that they need.
Thank you, Dr. Mabud. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question in the 30 seconds I have left?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. I think one of the things you saw very publicly, but would also be happening in a less public way now, is when there is an increase in demand, there is a hoarding by suppliers so that they can price gouge. And I think we saw this with testing a few months ago, where suddenly people were trying to sell tests for hundreds or even $1,000 because they knew there was increased demand. And this would stop that.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Harmon, for that. And anyone else who wants to comment, I'd be glad to see your responses in the record, but I have exceeded my time. And so, Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And we have a wave on the committee, and I want to welcome Mr. Carter and recognize you now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Madam Chair, before I begin, I understand that earlier this week, Mr. Soto, Representative Soto, had mentioned support for the America Competes Act earlier, as I say, on the floor this week. And I'd like entered into the record, and I ask for unanimous consent to be entered into the record, a letter to Congress from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposing the America Competes Act.
Oh, yes, without objection.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair, let me begin by saying that I applaud what you're doing here today, calling for a hearing to protect Americans from steep price increases. This is important, and I commend you for doing that. But I fear that what's happening here is that we're doing everything to avoid the reality and the simplest answer as to why we're seeing all these price increases, and that is democratic policies. Policies have consequences. And that's what we need to understand. President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, and Leader Schumer forced through some of the largest spending packages our country has ever seen, with policies that discouraged work, that ended energy projects, and bottlenecked our ports and distribution centers. Yet we act as if we are surprised that this has resulted in record inflation, the highest in nearly 40 years. Instead, we find the administration picking winners and losers by targeting industries that it disagrees with and attempting to weaponize the FTC, and doing so in a way that is not within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. In light of these actions, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record testimony from the North American Meat Institute. Thank you. This letter that was just allowed, and thank you again, Madam Chair, it describes how the meat industry has been affected by COVID-19. It addresses claims of consolidation within the industry, and it explains the market forces behind increased prices. Regardless, I think it would be eye-opening for my colleagues to hear a quote from Larry Summers, the former Secretary of the Treasury under President Obama, who said, if they're using inflation to get a mechanism to go after genuine monopoly problems, as I said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and it's all sort of fine. If they think this is a strategy for actually reducing inflation, they're badly wrong. You know, if you add in the new regulations or the proposed regulations that will add more costs to the industry, you see why we're in the situation we're in right now. Look, I'm not an economist. However, I did run a small business for 32 years, and I know that when the cost of inputs goes up, so does the cost of goods and services. It's just simple, basic economy. I wanted to ask Dr. Ritchie, supply chain issues at the ports. I have the honor and privilege of representing two major seaports, the Port of Brunswick and the Port of Savannah, and we've seen the supply chain issues firsthand. But I'm pleased to share with you that everyone on the committee that unlike many ports across the country, the Port of Savannah no longer has a backlog. At one time we had 31 ships offshore, but now we have 0. Now we are accommodating all of those ships. And this comes at a time as when this port moved a record 5.6 million containers in 2021, more than 1 million than the year before, making it the 3rd busiest port in the nation. And I believe that, and I know that they're doing it with a backlog. And that's the only major port in the country is in Savannah that's doing this without a backlog.
And I want to credit the common sense and the innovative approaches that the state of Georgia and the Ports Authority have taken to ensure that this happened. They have been very innovative. In fact, an example, last year, the Georgia Ports Authority was allowed to reallocate $8 million of their funding to convert inland facilities into pop-up container ports, and this is important. My question for you, Dr. Ritchie, what are some similar actions or innovations that states and industries can take to overcome the supply chain challenges we see in other areas like distribution centers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much for the question. I will say that the Port of Savannah has been a shining star in terms of innovation over the pandemic, and so there's a lot that we could learn at other ports from what's happened there. When you think about distribution centers, which are an area that's also kind of disruptive, there are lots of opportunities to use different types of automation facilities to move things along and assist with that movement. And I'd encourage members of Congress to take a trip to visit the MODEX conference, which takes place once a year in Atlanta, once a year in Chicago, to look at the options that are out there. The other thing I'd like to say quickly is that, you know, we don't see these innovations moving jobs for people. What we see is assistance and allowing them to work jobs that are easier to deal with. We don't expect to see automotive or truck AVs end up being something that drives people out of business in terms of truck driving. By the year 2035, we'll still need another 500,000 people to drive trucks in the United States.
Great. And again, thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to wave on, and thank you for your indulgence, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And now I want to thank our, there we go. I really want to thank all of our witnesses that are here today for their participation and for being here remotely or in person. I remind members that pursuant to the committee rules that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. We certainly encourage each witness to respond promptly to any questions that are sent your way. Would appreciate it very much. Before we are adjourning, I request unanimous consent to enter into the following into the record. We find these documents: a letter from Consumer Reports, a letter from the American Hospital Association, a letter from the National Association of Convenience Stores, a tweet from Bob McNary, a fact sheet from the Food Industry Association, an article from the Washington Post, a letter from the Transportation, what is that? Intermediary Association, a letter from the National Retail Federation, a letter to the FTC. And with that, with no objections, any objections, so ordered. At this time, the subcommittee, with my gratitude again to the witnesses, is adjourned.